Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinar, WKO4, the Ultimate Season Review. Funny question already from Robert Smith. Yeah, you know, what I'm doing now is pushing out the charts in advance to your chart library. So I dumped a bunch of charts on you guys today. Sorry about that. The reality is you can even follow along in your WKO4 with today's presentation. I'll get into why, but today's presentation is pretty chart heavy. So there's a reality of we're going to see some new stuff. Can anybody confirm in the question box that you can hear me? As always, I want to make sure I'm not talking to myself for a half an hour before it gets too late. Great. Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Cool. All right, let's jump right in. Same process as always. As a matter of fact, more so tonight. You can always ask questions as we go. There's this little box in the top right-hand corner. If you're not familiar with the system, I see a lot of repeat offenders here, so you should be. You can just open and close this box by the arrow. One of the options is questions. If you have a little plus mark there, the box will be closed. All you need to do is enter the question here. I actually see it. I'm off here on another screen. I like to answer questions as I go. If you see a chart or something and you have a question, put it in there. One of the things I tend to do is I smooth the answer into the whatever I'm reviewing, and then it's only if like, wow, I'm not going to specifically answer that will I stop. But I'm pretty good at managing as I go. And in today's presentation is very chart rich and a little less process. So feel free to ask how I might use it, and I'll give you an opinion. Speaking of opinions, as always, I give my caveat. It's funny, someone finally noticed I was using different quotes and stuff like that on my opinion slide. These are my opinions. You know, I've been coaching for a long time. I do work with professional athletes, world champions, Olympians, things like that, and that's great. I get exposed to a tremendous amount of data and insight. I also work with plenty of age groupers and masters and everything else. So, you know, I really enjoy the coaching side. The software side is a little offshoot that seems to suck me deeper and deeper, but these days it's really great because I get the opportunity to work with such, you know, amazing people as in our Facebook group and people in this meeting, and share some knowledge. I don't profess to know everything. You know, I've worked with a lot of physiologists and a lot of smart people. I've got a luxury and an advantage, so that's cool. But even though I might present stuff, this is my way, my opinion. So no one is forced to follow it. As a matter of fact, when we started WKO4, our goal was to give you a tool to really develop your own workflow, not just use a group of reports or a pre-packaged system, but really work on and learn what's important to you. So let's jump in. First thing when you look at review, right? Review is a process. You know, and you guys, these webinars can be so hard to do because you're kind of taking something that you've done with a process, but yet it's got a lot of intuition and habit in it, and you have to communicate that to other people. So when I was thinking about what is the core steps of my process when I start looking at a season review, so I look at a season review for two different reasons. As a season review, I just look at to analyze what the history was, what happened, did we meet goals. I'm also looking for insights already planning on the next season. That being said, the reality is I don't necessarily look at it in an analytical sense in planning the forward-going season. Don't get me wrong, I come back to the data, but I always separate those as two separate purposes. We're going to do, and I actually did one last year, but this year's we can go deeper with a lot more capability in WKO4, you know, using your data to build the perfect annual plan. So the reality is I'll do that next. I'm going to really focus on kind of just diagnosing, taking a look at this season. I break the process into what I call overview. I like to look at a lot of data. I used to call it, I still do, I was actually joking with my wife Kathy about this, the data hunter, the treasure hunter, right? So don't start out with a high purpose in your overview. You're just going to look at a lot of areas and stuff like that. You're going to begin to look for a pattern, a uniqueness, a change. And the idea is once you start to see something, that gives you insight. Insight's kind of like that aha moment. Look at that. You're not really sure what's in it. You might not be sure what's the driver, what's the effect, everything else, but you might look at it as, aha, you know, that's something I want to look at. Once you have that insight, you want to drill into it. So I'm going to focus more on here to not get into too much minutia. But then once you start to drill in, you do what I call a cause and effect search. You know, what caused it? What was the effect? What could be related? Then once you think you know, you look at more data looking to test and confirm. If you walk out of a season review, you've got two major focuses. One, you want to say, wow, Mr. and Mrs. Athlete, did we accomplish a goal? We set out, we had a big event goal, we had something like that, blah, blah, blah. And how did we do and how well did we do? That's part of it, but you're also looking for causality, right? This relationship, whether it's diagnostic, whether it's analytical, whether it's predictive even, you're looking for these certain relationships and patterns and something in the data that gives you deeper and more individualized insight into that particular athlete. So that being said, when you start at the overview, kind of the core thing to think about when I was writing this, I know there's such a variation. You typically have a purpose or a goal of a season. So maybe a purpose of a goal, using 2016 as a timely example, right? You might, and I've oversimplified this, but I want to give some thinking about my process. So when I set goals, I'm always doing it in a way that has a lot of measurability. And my goals have a goal, a milestone, and then that leads to a series of actions, right? So goals, milestones, and I bet you half the people here have seen some of my planning webinars. So let's just hypothetically say a goal could be to win Masters Nationals road race, right? That's a goal. Milestones are the tricks, the data, the pieces, the points, the things you have to achieve to increase the chances. There's no guarantees, as we know as coaches, to doing it. I always break those down maybe in some measurable numbers. All these are just examples. This is no real goal. So one of the things that I found being able to utilize all the new metrics is building these metrics into goals. It's important to say this now because last year at this time you didn't have half of these metrics. You had less capability. WKO4 was really blossoming on the scene, all this flexibility and data crunching. Remember where you were last year, really 2 years ago even, when you were crunching data. You had some mean max power charts in a PMC. We forget how far analytics is coming. Now you have, you know, it's got to affect your goal setting and your review. You have FTP, FRC, PMAX. You could be using TTE, stamina, tons of things. You know, we have CTL goals and some specific power goals. So this is kind of typical of something I might set up as a goal. When you review the goal, you start out with one thing, right? And this is where as a coach and as a self-coached, and it's actually much harder as a self-coached athlete, by the way, what I'm about to say, is the first answer, the first question, the first answer you have when you review a goal is very black or white. It is yes or no, right? Always start at what is your goal. Well, we see it here clearly laid out. Clearly laid out, right? And Lucas, I see your question. I'm certainly going to get there. Also, Craig, I see your question. I'm going to get there. But when you start with the goal, don't be gray, right? The first thing you have to be willing to say is yes or no. You know, and it's funny, as a coach, you got to motivate your athletes and you got to keep them, and you always want to give them good news, right? Or as a self-coached athlete, you always want to give yourself good news, face it, right? But the reality is if you're going to start a good season review, and part of that is did I accomplish goal, start with yes or no. Because no means you're looking for what stopped you, what were your barriers, and yes means what drove those results. Being able to make it like as a decision tree really helps you. I'm going to show you in a moment. So start with the clarity based on the goals. Yes, we accomplished our goals this season. No, we didn't. That doesn't mean the answer might not be in a little bit in the middle, but start here. Goals should always have performance, targets, factors. So performance is like a place, a time, a result. Win Masters Nationals. Targets, milestones, power, speed, time. Factors, I didn't put any factors in mine because there's a light, but I often, you know, will put in factors. Like a factor, a classic factor is you might, in your goal statement, have a factor. Athlete only has 10 hours a week to train, right? That's a factor. It's a big obstacle maybe to some bigger goals. Then you have to review against these, which I'll get into. The review itself is here's a little bit of a workflow model. So you start with that overview. You're doing your yes, no, right? You can almost put yes, no here. And then based on yes, you're looking to find out what drove results. No, you're looking to find out what stopped results. That doesn't mean you're going to get some, like I said, you'll get some cross of both, but you want to drive it. Then you want to see what the success drivers were and barriers. And even as you begin to separate what caused you to fail, there's still some success in there. When you succeed, there's still some barriers. So that's my point. It's not that you ignore one for the other. It's more of a drill down. The insights I was talking about really happens here. You start to notice this, wow, something's going on here. An overview is what I call the art of looking around. To simply know what type of data, you're going to compartmentalize your data. I'm going to give you mine in the next slide, but just compartmentalize your data. Are you just looking at MMP? I mean, I remember 3-4 years ago, again, we had training load and maximal powers, you know, and that really focused everything in our season review. Now we have a lot more. Review with open eyes. If you haven't watched Dean Golich's presentation on bias, there's a webinar on it in the playlist. Go back and watch that. You know, Dean's an excellent coach, way smarter than me, and definitely knows his stuff. But yet he's insightful enough as somebody who's been doing his job for a long time to be really careful with bias. If you go into a season review with bias, you often just prove your bias. You want to be very open-eyed. You want to be unbiased. What are you looking for? Something that makes you notice. Some form of change, something odd, something good, something bad. Then that gives you insight into the drill down. So what types of data do I look at? Here's my list, of which 5 are data and 1 is relationship. So I look at power duration and peaks. I look at fatigue performance. A lot of people have been on my webinars before. You know I preach fatigue and fatigue resistance. I look at training load, training content, and physiological response. And then I'm always looking in the relationship about compliance. Underneath there, I'm kind of saying what I'm doing: curve reviews, shape maps, classic peaks, target peaks, fatigue resistance, fatigue performance. A lot of great new stuff in WKO4, and this wasn't even available 2 months ago. I've been beta testing for a little while longer, so I'm a little ahead of the curve, so I'm going to show you some cool things, but good stuff. Training load, training content, all of it should make pretty much sense. All right. Another thing to say before I get into my review, and I've shown this before, I always break down, and this is where I really preach process. If you have a process, doesn't mean you're rigid. A process really means that you have a system that then one step always supports the next. So if you guys remember in your season setup, and anyone who's watched my Getting Started webinars through everything, I always say I set up my athletes really with a season. So I do the full season, which, you know, I've in this hypothetical, this is a sandbox athlete. All the athletes I'm going to show here today are just test people. But hypothetically, their season started 11/1/15 to today. Then I break down the base period, so November 1 to March 1, and build is March 2nd to May 1, and then May 2nd back to 10/1 with a month off in between. So I've kind of broken that into a base build race or performance phase. I do that for 2, 3, 4 years back, depending on the athlete, because it really allows me to compare phases, periodized phases, 1 year to the next or full years to the next, and I'm going to demo plenty of that. Excuse me, I'll take a drink. I limit this breakdown though, so review by periodization. I only want to do 3. Excuse me. I saw somebody else's chart the other day, and they had like 8 periods of periodization in 1 year. It's too granular for me. I think one of the problems of power training as a whole is we tend to look for too high of a precision. I mean, it's almost, you know, you miss the forest for the trees. So the reality is I'll never do more than 3, 4 at the max, which you're seeing 3 periodized plans, 1 here. All you need to do is build these, is hit a plus, set your range to whatever you want dates to, blah, blah, blah. All right, let's jump into some review. So first thing I review, and I really become so dependent on the power duration curve and some of the performance factors in it, Occasionally I have some problems with the power duration curve if an athlete isn't going hard and stuff like that, but the reality is if they're not going hard, I'm probably not doing that time period doesn't play heavily into my factor. Otherwise than that, the power duration curve, particularly now that we can clean it much easier, is really my go-to way of looking at true performance. I still look at peaks in the classic approach at looking at peaks, but power duration really is and the power duration metrics is my go-to. So a classic one that I start with is one that you all have, but it's been updated in your chart pack. This is orange line is showing MFTP, the green line is showing FRC, the purple line is showing Pmax. What I add to mine is VO2 max, so here's the VO2 max, and I could have chosen a better color than set FTP, and then time to exhaustion here, so TTE. I don't use stamina because it changes slowly. I mean, I do, don't get me wrong, and it's something to look at, but it changes slowly, and I often think it's, an underpin, and I would only look at it for select athletes doing longer events, which I would take really any Ironman, tri, any marathon, any ultra, that type of deal. So this is an easy starting place. Let's just talk about what I'm looking at. I'm looking at trend relationships. I can quickly see, right, this athlete improved over the year. We can see that, look, their MFTP was coming up throughout the year. So we know that they had a good growth. I don't know if it's the right growth, but we know it was positive moving. TTE was actually coming down right here as MFTP started to go up. So that might highlight me, like what was happening here, right? This TTE is coming down while FTP is going up. Common mistake is everyone associates TTE with FTP in the sense of movement. If the FTP gets TTE, so many acronyms, right? If time to exhaustion gets shorter, we tend to somehow put it in our brain that FTP is going down. Well, the reality is maybe it is, maybe it isn't. And here you see that in going forward as it gets shorter. So FTP is improving as TTE is getting shorter. It's a game of averages. You have 60 recorded power a minute, recordings a minute, times 60 minutes. So it's a law of averages that can surprise you. Their FRC was going up through the season. So man, if you were coaching this athlete, and I don't, even though this is a friend of mine, so I know what he's doing, his FTP is going up, his FRC is going up, his Pmax is staying pretty good, goes up here late season, and then suddenly starts peaking here late. And look, his VO2 max is also going up. So you would look at this and you'd say, pretty good season. This athlete has shown improvement. Well, let's drill down. Let's see if we can figure out maybe what's going on with TT or why this is changing. Let's take a more periodized view. And all of these new charts like this one, they're in your chart library. You should get a little alert. By the way, if they're not in your chart library, sync your WKO4. It's the syncing. They come in with the syncing format. So every time you sync, if there's any new files or any new charts, they come down. So this really has become one of my go-to charts, and it really is something, that I use for a season review, and there's a couple of things I want to show you what's happening here. So regardless of the fact that I have 2016 season, I should have put the config box in here. I'm using athlete range to fix these ranges. So you see how I have dates? Well, you can use athlete ranges. So I built an athlete range for these set of dates, an athlete range for these set, and these set, and that's what we're seeing here. I can accomplish the same thing by command clicking, as you guys know, but for certain season review, I've used the athlete review, and I'll show you on my Mac here in a minute. I'll have to switch screens. I'll show you later in the presentation how I did it, but basically it's just using the expression athlete range, so I can lock down the time range. So using athlete range, what I have going on here is the red and the shaded underneath are my 2016 entire, so here's my 2016 entire PD curve. So this one is showing, the shaded red is showing my entire curve. Now what I've done is I've taken the base, and I gave base a color of blue, I gave build a color of green, and then race perform a color of red as lines. So these three are lines. So working backwards, you can see the dark red line is the race period. Obviously this athlete's having peak performance across all points, all time points in the race season. So they really come on late. Well, that correlates with this, right? We're seeing everything move up. Their VO2 max is driving, FRC is driving, FTP is driving. That gives us a good feel. But I can see by the green, the build period, build wasn't that far behind it. And then here is their base period was far behind, but you would sort of expect that, right? I should have claimed I coached this guy. That looks like by the money, right? That's by the book. Each periodized phase building on top of each other, right, and happening. So this gives me some really good visual insight at first. I can see more gap occurred here. Well, this person was riding the trainer a lot. It is a friend, so I know what they were doing. And I did write their training plan to some degree. So I wrote it when it was blue. So he got better after I stopped helping him. But you can see here in his sprint got a little stronger. Sure, he got out of winter training. He's getting to mixing it up a little more and more. He's throwing it down, so that gets better. We can see the area. He was starting to close the gap in his build here. Well, he was working on this. This is a limiter of his, so he was working on this. And then here, we actually see more improvement later in the overall. So visually, we see some interesting things. Now what I have going here, and again, I'm using athlete range, so I don't need the command click. I've just built these in athlete range. I'm looking at peak 1 minute, 5 minute, 20 minute, and 60 minute NP for each of those ranges, base, build, race. Whenever you see a parentheses, I never trust one piece of data. So I always average when it comes to, sometimes when I'm looking at max, don't get me wrong, when I'm looking at a pure max, but I've seen enough bad data to not trust one. So I tend to average the top 3 or the top 5 together. So if you look at the config of this report, you will see the top 3 or the top 5 averaged together. So what this little 5 is telling you is this is the top 5 averaged together. So I can see the 1 minute peak base, build, race. Cool, I'm seeing that here too. So actually it's here by 1 minute. Looking good, improving. 5 minutes, base, build, peak. 20 minutes, you get it, 234, 241, 268, and 60 minutes NP, 228, 244, 267. So this is good, right? Again, I should have claimed this athlete. Good growth across the board. I can visually see where growth has happened. These all improve. So I would look at this and I'm looking at the result and say, good stuff. Right now, again, I'm staying away from drilling down. Let's say my athlete achieved their result. Let's say they achieved their goal. They won Masters Nationals, right? That was the goal. I won't go all the way back there. So I'd say, well, part of it is we raised fitness all across the board. This is pretty good stuff, right? This athlete raised his fitness all the way across the board and at each peak time period. Great work. Now let's look a little deeper. So one of the things that I preach in coaching, right, is we tend to think of 1 year cycles, macro cycles. I highly recommend you think in 3 or 4 year cycles with an athlete. Now, of course, that's hard because an athlete doesn't typically stay with a coach for that long, but it still helps to think that way because physiological changes don't happen overnight. Newer athletes, mature athletes kind of can tend to be locked down, but you really want to look at longer trend. So when I'm doing season review, you'll see a lot of times that I'll review against previous 3 years so that I end up with a 4-year trend relationship. So what this chart is doing, again, I'm using athlete range in my season review because I don't want to have to command click initially. I have other charts that would do that. I just want to see the data, one stroke. Doesn't matter what I have selected over here. So here I'm 2016, so same power duration curve, which we know was driven. And here I've got an average power duration curve of the last 3 years. So I've averaged the last 3 years together. And when you look at the last 3 years, a little different picture starts to emerge, doesn't it? So the yellow, this athlete was actually stronger in time periods all the way down probably to about 2.5 minutes, 3 minutes here in a logarithmic. But look what's happening now. They're getting stronger out from like 3 minutes out. So that's what this line is measuring. So we have this little red line, and it's a little weird because it's logarithmic, so you'd have to hover over it. See where it's saying current versus previous years? So the line should be more negative, but in the logarithmic curve, it can distort what that looks like. So the reality is if you were to hover over this chart, like I just randomly picked 2248, this athlete is 22 watts stronger this year versus an average of the previous 3 years. So their overarching trend is pretty positive, but we see what's happening here. This is a 50-year-old Masters. 49, here he was at 49, 47, 46, right? So the reality is part of he's getting old, and if he's doing some extra work here, looks like he might be paying the price here, right? And that's the nature of all training. It's sigmoidal. It's really hard to focus on one area, and I'm seeing these type of questions come up a lot more on Facebook without pushing down another one. It's a cost benefit to everything. So Lucas, that's a good question. I'll answer yours specifically. Does an average of 3-year PD curve differ from a 3-year curve set up by setting a 3-year time range? No, because it's still, the PD curve is driven off the mean maximal power. If you take the mean maximal power, it would be the same off the 3 years. Your point is valid though, in the sense that that could be slightly different if you took each year's power duration curve and did a mathematical averaging. So you make a good point. I should be careful with the term average. That's why I verbally said it, but I have previous 3 years PD curve in there. So good catch and good point. I use, the range of in there. So good catch and way to keep it. Then here I'm looking at a couple of key things, because when I'm looking at 4 years, I'm looking at physiology. And one of the things that's really cool to me, and you're going to see more of this in the next couple of months, there's a little teaser alert. Look at their VO. I'm looking at the physiological response because that's what I'm looking for over time. So look what happened to this person's VO2 max. It went up. Now, you've heard it time and time again. I'll just answer the question before people ask me. I heard VO2 max, you can't train it. It doesn't go up. It does go up. It is trainable. You can get great response from being a fully trained athlete, training 25, 26, 30 hours a week and running full-on pro schedules. You're probably at the maximum of your genetic maximal VO2. Most of us, normal people training, 8, 10, 12 hours a week, you're not. You can continue to improve towards it, and VO2 max can go up. I look at MFTP, I kind of see that. I do believe, because people think it's always about lactate. FTP is a good estimate of your maximal lactate steady state and LT1, but those really, more than the lactate, it also is a transition in energy system. So the reality is that is part of the physiology that I'm tracking, and we can see that's gone up. And you can watch, I talked about that in the FTP webinar. And I'm looking at stamina. Is this person increasing in general stamina? And yeah, they are. So, they're not doing a lot of long rides. You could kind of pick that up here, but their stamina is still increasing. And this person actually has a pretty solid stamina. And riding with them, it makes kind of sense. So the reality is we see some good things. Now to get a little more complex, because we haven't gotten complex enough, because this is part of the drill down, right? I'm seeing something, we're seeing a pattern. We're seeing some cost here, some benefit here. We're seeing the improvements happening here that jives with our initial charts. Here we have the PD curve, what I actually call the fatigue resistance PD comparison. So the reality is, to try to just keep moving along, this is part of the new stuff. And I'm going to show you 2 or 3 charts of this. And this is so cool. This is something that is a difference maker at the pro level or in longer events. And we've broken this up in a couple of ways, which I'll touch on in later, actually. So here's their PD curve now, right? And this was Dean Golich put in, he emailed Kevin and I, and he's like, I just can't make this work. I want to make it work so bad. And he was looking at peak performance after 2,000 kilojoules using some of the new metrics and stuff like that that we've created recently that, I think are some of the cooler new, I guess, ideas, thinking, blah, 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 whatever we want to call it, in the system. So, and he's really just using the cumulative sum. So he's using what's happening after to make this happen. And all the expressions are in the charts I sent you, so use them. So then Kevin got it and said, here's a one-up. So these are, and I see some questions about the PD curve isn't working for the last 3 years. Sit tight. Don't know why, but I'll answer it at the end. So what you're seeing here is the reality is, here's their current PD curve, right? And this green is the PD curve after, for this athlete, this chart example, it's 3,000 kilojoules. So look how much this person drops in fatigue. And what the dashed lines are showing you are watts lost after 3,000 kilojoules and percentage decline after 3,000 kilojoules. So this athlete at 37, again, I don't know why I picked these times, just what happened then in the screenshot, is fatigued to the point where their 37-minute power goes down a whopping 56% after 3,000 kilojoules. So that's pretty interesting insight. Yeah, a couple of people are saying it takes a long time to calculate. Calculating 3 years of every single piece of MMP data takes some time because realize it reads every second of 3 years. MMP is the most intensive. So just sit tight, let it calculate, and it will come up eventually. Leave it sit on the screen while you're listening to my amazing presentation. So the reality is this is pretty cool when you start thinking about it because it shows you actual watts lost and percentage decline. So pretty interesting how fatigue affects us. And you guys, you've heard me say it, and I'm sure you've heard a lot of other smarter coaches than me say it. This is the difference maker if you want to take an athlete pro. They have to be able to perform fatigue. Have to. Now the charts I broke up, you'll see I sent you, Kevin and I had a lot of discussion whether we break them up by kilojoules because a lot of people don't ride more than 3,000 kilojoules. So we broke them into like Pro 1-2, which was 3,000 kilojoules plus, and then we called it Cat 3-4-5 at 2,000 kilojoules plus. You guys know enough, pretty much everybody here knows enough, just tweak the kilojoules to be whatever you want, but all the formulas are in there. Now we're looking at peak performance, so this goes back to your question, Lucas, so you can do it now. You can just use the expressions that are right in the charts. Peak after their peak 5 minutes after 3,000 kilojoules isn't that bad. 328 versus 317. I'm fixing this. I think the athlete range is all season, by the way. And I think this is real, being clicked on all season. And then their peak 20 minutes, now they're dropping 30 watts. So they can hold 5 minutes okay, but their longer stuff, man, their fatigue resistance here is soft. So, and hold on while I close some questions. There's so many in there, I can't read them all. But good stuff. Keep them coming, you guys. I'm adjusting as I go. So hopefully I'm answering them generally as I go. So that's a cool chart. Take some time, spend some time with it. It'll give you some amazing insight into fatigue. I got a couple more later. This is one that I think people should use more. It's what they call the WAC chart. And it's Williams, what was it? Williams, Allen, Coggin. We were sitting on the four of us. It should be CC. I'm going to complain someday. We were sitting on a call talking about comparing against world class, like the top line in the power duration curve. So you know the top line in the power duration curve, which is world class, the highest data performance that we see, the average of the highest data performance that we see. So basically all the WAC is doing is comparing against world class. So it's just against world class. So it's interesting when you do this, right? Because here I just have, again, I'm using athlete range to fix seasons. So the dark white, the heavy white is this year. And then the dashed is the last 3 years, 15, 14, 13. So we see what we're sawing before. This athlete, though, even against world class, has a real nice improvement going on out here in this time range. They're giving up here. But we really now see actually better than 2013. Their 15 and 14 season, they had a little more punch in here. So if you think about we're drilling down this little change here, we're actually seeing it by season by comparing it against each year. So against world class for your WAC score, that's a pretty cool way of looking at it. So interesting new, remember, we're in the trend relationship. I'm really looking at just power duration driven metrics and peaks. And finally, I put this, This is, and I have it selected as all seasons, classic peak performance. So you see, and I should have, sometimes when you take screenshots, it doesn't, it screws up, there's no numbers, but you get the point. So here you see all your classic peaks that you would track in WKO3 or training peaks, and here you see them daily stacked. I can see the same thing the other things we're seeing. Look, I can see peak, particularly the shorter numbers or the blue, everything's getting higher as this person goes through the season. So is there a way to compare other Masters riders? Yeah, so Will, I think you're answering about the WAC against Masters. Look up WAC chart, in which, just naming a chart WAC, we shouldn't be allowed to do that, but look up the WAC chart in your chart library and actually has a Masters adjusted line. And I could have put that in here because this is a 50-year-old rider. But if you look up the WAC chart, WAC, WAC chart, there's actually a Masters adjusted number in there. And it's really just taking about how much you would drop off of world class. Now, because I want to blow you guys away, a couple of people asked me with prepared, I want to blow you guys away with color and detail. This is what my own little thing. I look at MMP clusters. So one of the things that really helps me determine peak is when an athlete can hit peak performance. So remember we were looking at 1 minute, 5 minute, 20 minute, you know, your peaks, your kind of classic peaks. I want to know how well they cluster them together. If the peak is clustered low, I'm not as impressed. So there's an underlying chart. This is MMP peaks time-based. It's in your chart library. I see everything kind of moving forward, but what I'm really looking at here is the data. I've selected the last couple of seasons here to look at, specifically the seasons, and I'm looking at, and this is not the same athlete, by the way. I took this from something else. So let me just blow this up, and hopefully you can see enough of this, but you can do the experiment and do it on yourself, but I'll show you what I'm looking for. So let's just take 20 minutes as an example in the name of time. I can see their max 20-minute power from the last 4 years. I can see the average of top 5, right? So let's just take here their 325, 321. Here the average is 308, 304. So then what I'm looking for percentage is how close in cluster is that top 5 to their actual max. So for like this athlete, that percentage range, I want it to be like high, like 98% and above. When I see it below 95, it really makes me raise an eyebrow. 1, about the data, or 2, about the athlete's true underlying fitness for select time performance. So look at this athlete, right? All of it's in the 94, 95s, maybe 96. Same down here. Even in the normalized power, this is 98, 96, 96, 95. I'll tell you right now, what I've learned, you'll see this, is a person who group rides too much. You don't actually get tightly clustered peaks unless you train and race, do a lot of group riding. This is exactly what's happening. You just don't cluster as well as your maxes. You don't get truly on that peak form, being able to kill it, hit good high numbers and hit them consistently. So it's one of the things I'm looking at. As a pro and working with pros, I want that to be 97, 98. To be honest with you, a little secret, I learned that from Team Sky. So just kind of working with those guys, that's how they determine form. That's one of the things they look at. So who's going to go to the tour? You better be clustering in that very high percentile rate because that's what they see as form. All right, moving into a different category because I'm already, as always, running late. Fatigue resistance. Okay, another new chart using the cumulative sum function. This one is, to me, a deal breaker. So, and all I really did, right, I cleaned up the last chart, is it's just cleaner. All we have here is a power duration curve in MMP and power duration after 3,000 kilojoules. This is the Pro 1-2. You can use the 345, which I said. And those are all based off 2,000 kilojoules. So it's tracking the same thing. To make it simpler, I just dropped everything down here. The reason this is a difference maker, and I put it in both areas because what I'm really looking at is fatigue, right? This person cannot perform well in fatigue. The reality is, and it's tracking the same kind of number, I can see here at 30 minutes, this person, and I think this is the same athlete as I showed, is dropping 24%. So no new breakthrough here, except everyone wonders how you separate these charts. Just change the name. You can type in the name of the X and Y axis. So just change the axis so they match, and you can separate. And these would, if I was using the real charts, they would scroll together. So just remember that trick. I constrained it, the belower one, for just up to an hour, because after 3,000 kilojoules, you don't really care what happens after another hour. I mean, you could always expand it. All I did was limit the X and Y, but take a look at how I did it. This is very cool. You know, we're going to keep looking at this more and more as far as performance. If you're a stage racer, if you're a stage racer, if you participate in longer events, this is so important for you. You know, longer road races, by the time you probably get to Cat 2 and up, super important. You want to go pro, absolute deal breaker. You would have to close this gap a whole lot more to ever go pro. So somebody asked, can I repeat how I separated these? So one chart with two charts going on that would be coordinated. All I did in the x-axis, you notice it, I changed the I changed the x-axis, which is here, the x. See here it's just HMS, and here it's H:M:S, so it's just a different way. So every piece of data I want in the top chart, I have to use the x-axis HMS. For the pieces of data I want in the lower, I'm using H:M:S. So then it groups them together. So one chart, I have two functions. Again, if I could move my mouse, it's a screenshot, they would move in conjunction with each other time-wise, as long as you don't have something like totally unrelated going on. So hopefully that helps, Lucas. I showed this one last week, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but really is I'm using more and more. I find it pretty interesting. So basically I'm taking a mean max normalized power curve and I'm rating how fast it drops off of FTP based on normalized power. I really did this because of cross and crit racers and stuff like that, but I'm finding it's really, you know, even road racers and things like that, it's pretty interesting to look at, and I would put it in the full-time repertoire, so I grabbed it. So this is your fatigue resistance NP for cross, but it's a pretty good one to look at. So I look at this athlete, and their fatigue, their rate here it's too steep. So this person has a lot of fatigue. Their power decay is too quickly. So if you didn't see last week's webinar, in the name of time, watch it. You can explain this a little deeper. I use this. I know there's been a lot of fatigue charts put about sprint fatigue, and Donnie Key was really the guy who started all this with all these great charts. Him and I were kicking it around, and we just kind of built and built. I still use this original one because it gives me insight into Pmax, what I'm comparing against, and the percentage decline of Pmax. So what I'm really looking at is this sprint, how a sprint over time, and here I'm just looking at 5, 10, 20, 30 seconds. So I'm looking at the FR, how quickly I'm burning through FRC. This person's decline from Pmax at 5 seconds, they're only 0.9. Well, remember Pmax is 1 full revolution, so closer. By 10 seconds, they're 6.8. By 20 seconds, they're 19.3. By 30 seconds, they're 28.3. So they're really starting to decline here in power. You see the power going down. You know, here it's 1080, here it's 1010, here it's 874, here it's 770. But I can tell you now by experience, and this is where it depends on the type of racer and everything else, but again, remember, I'm just showing you guys ways to look for insight. This person's reasonably fatigue resistant at sprints. You see the drop-off rates often being more. So it gives me insight into, you know, they can kind of sustain, they can throw it out there and sustain it. And one chart I threw in here because I couldn't help it, I stole this from Andy's presentation because this is Andy himself. In long-term trending, he's looking at year over year, he did a pretty cool cross of stamina versus fiber type. So if you're a triathlete, a long-distance athlete, you know, a triathlete really focused on Ironman and longer, and maybe some sprints in Olympics, it would give you some insight. He's looking at fiber type and stamina to see if there's a relationship. And he actually shows a really interesting relationship, you know, there is, and his is, as his stamina goes up, his fiber type is moving each year more and more and more towards slow twitch. Why I put this here is that does show you that you can, through enough training, transition your fast twitch B to truly, or two, or however you want to look at it, to truly perform in a more efficient slow twitch format, which to long distance athletes and people doing longer events, that shows that there is, you know, a real important reason to focus on that, because you literally can shift your physiology to do it. And I know most people know that, but you can see a pretty significant shift. And this is Andy's very clean multi-year data. So another something you could see over time that just might be a trend. Remember, I'm kind of giving you my off the cuff, we're in the overviews. So these are things I might look at over time. Let's look at training review, training load review. Start with the basics. This is PMC and monthly data, right? Don't excuse how powerful these basic ones can be. Lots of great information here. I see this athlete reasonably flat, looks like here. I see some peaks, I see some numbers. I don't see any real relationships here. I can look here and I can say, wow, this person did a nice step up in summer training, 27, 43 hours. So they moved the ball, even in distance, and, you know, notched up some good TSS here these last 2 months, which jives, right? Remember, we were showing his improvement in the summer, and wow, he trained more and he got fitter. You can see it here in his CTL. Simple chart, monthly overview. I shade the background, total duration. I use bars for TSS, and then I'm just looking at 5, 1. And by the way, your charts aren't all white like mine. I do that so you see it better, but then before we load them, Debbie transitions them into better colors in case you're using a white background. So I'm just checking peaks and TSS and duration. This is a different athlete. I'm not saying I'm even learning anything great here. As a matter of fact, there's a little bit of a TSS stagnation going on. Might have rested and rebuild. You know, here you see your typical season, right? So build, 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 build. You taper it down a little bit into the race season. You overreach for a little bit as you peak for an event. You go down, down, down. You overreach a little bit as you peak for an event. Down, down, down. Look what happened here in their peaks. So their short stuff was peaking in the overreaching, but they were struggling a little bit of an FTP. I think that's 20 minutes. Yeah, a little bit of a 20-minute kind of plateau was hit. So that was what it tells me. But let's take a little different view, something I shared with you, and this is one of my annual planner. So when I'm looking at a CTL, I still want to keep things basic, but I visually want to look for relationships. I tend to want to see, you want to look for relationships. You have this chart. So all I did here, the blue is your CTL. I don't even have ATL on the chart because TSB is the inverse of ATL. So I get it. I know what it's telling me. I'm really more interested in the fatigue because I'm season reviewing. If I'm looking at the whole season, ATL is a little too up-down, but yet I want to know how tired they were with certain things. What I have happening here in CTL is when it's below 60% of the peak for the year, so it uses the peak for the year as the basis. When it's below 60%, you get this red line. And then you can see right here it goes over. When it's above 90% of peak CTL for a year, it goes bright green. So I'm at some of my highest training level. So this doesn't look this important here because this athlete, you know, pretty predictable. They bumped around here, and it was only here they're doing that big ox push. But what's interesting is you see all their peaks kind of come, and then I drew these lines. This is the base. So base, build, race. Base, build, race. So you see the peaks coming really in their build. It wasn't until they started pushing some real CTL here did it start happening. It was this. They were getting fit. I know exactly what happened. This person got sick. Was off for a while. Was a doctor, and so got probably not sick from training. He just got sick. Came back. Did a little push, did a little push. Look, by the second push, he started hitting best. The second push created more, but he still wasn't at the peak. And here he is now doing a summer build. His schedule's opened up. He has more time, but notice he's not peaking. Well, look at his fatigue here, right? So it's showing up red when you have either deep fatigue or deep freshness. He's just in what I call a trough. He's doing a lot of training. He's adding a lot of fatigue, so he's not popping off bests yet. Based off what I'm seeing here, right, here to here, I bet you he's going to have some bests here in the fall. Might not suit what he's doing, but it's when it's going to happen. But why is it important to do the red and the green? It could actually give you some different insight when you look at somebody training at a higher CTL. So here's a CTL from somebody training probably more pro. This is a pro racer. So the reality is you see their rest period, it's all based off 90% of max, right? So rest period, build, 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 sit, 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 early race season. There was a crash in this early race season, kind of threw off our training schedule, blah, blah, blah. All right, we start getting ready for a big event happening late in May. So you're talking about nationals, build, 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 bam, pop those bests right for that overreaching, get through nationals, you rest a little bit. We drop off the green, we're off for 90%, build, 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 build. You see this second overreach, bam, another great rest. As a matter of fact, this person had some of their best performance ever right here. It just wasn't at 20 minutes. So, you know, you see it here in an everyday athlete. Remember, it's still 90%, so it'll show up for anyone. It's not an absolute, but it works. This purple line is rolling ramp rate. So I can see when they take on rapid CTL builds. So you can see here, pretty aggressive through this period. That's a pretty high ramp rate of building, building, building. But then we settle through the year, little overreach. But when we rest, you see that drop off. And we came back with a pretty good ramp rate, peaking here in the final overreach days. You can see we drive TSB low, ramp rate high. So the reality is I get some really good insights about this athlete. I know about this athlete, and this was nice to have, but it's not typical of the athlete. They need a certain amount of time in the green before this starts happening. Think about what I'm saying to you. As you look at some of these people, you might see more relationships than you think. There's a certain amount of time you have to be at your high CTL, because that's extra stress and strain, right? You're introducing high stress, your body's going under high strain. It needs to get fitness. Once you put all that stress on, your body needs, and strain on, it needs time to adapt. So we see it pretty patternistic. So I've got a pretty good idea of the range it takes for this person to really start firing off bests. Here's an interesting way to look at it, going back to this original athlete. I just have a very simple chart. I shared it. CTL, all the line is CTL. What I'm doing down here, and I should have blown this up, I'm counting days over 90, and I'm comparing 4 years here, 16, 15, 14, 13. So you can see here, you can't probably see, in 2013 they only had 12 days over 90. In 13, 10 days. But in 14 they had 36, and in 16 they had 82. So the reality is it's getting a nice little kick. You know, you can see this person's spending more days at high CTL. So more days at high CTL. Very interesting look over multiple years, by the way. You'd be surprised what that chart might tell you as far as it's one thing to hit. I mean, actually, you know, it's kind of funny. You can see here in the lines, you'd look at these CTL lines and you wouldn't think there was that much of a difference. That 2016, 82 days over 90. 2013, only 12. It doesn't look like that, does it? So pretty good factor. I still use this. This has been in a lot of webinars already, but it's just a go-to for me. All it's tracking is your peak 20 against CTL. It's a cross chart. So this person trains higher, but look, most of their peaks come between 73 and 93. This is a different person. I actually did this for a consult recently and got permission to use the data. So even though they train, they spend time kind of pushing all the way up to 100, 110. It's not steady enough. As a matter of fact, they don't spend enough time there. So most of their peaks come between 70 and 90. It gives me insight about what to train to. Unless I'm really willing to push to a next plateau, which would be 110, 120, probably just look at all these dots over here that are not peaks. Probably just creating more fatigue than we're creating response. Same thing for TSB. This athlete actually needs very positive TSB to perform. 26, the dash is just the DAT, meaning the data. So it's not negative 26, it's actual positive 26 to hit peaks. Some people are like that. I need load, some people are freshness. So again, I'm looking at the season, I'm seeing insights, I'm starting to build and understand this athlete better and better. So now let's look at training content. Let's start out with the basics again. You notice that's my trend. Time and zones. It's a classic go-to. It gives us insight. This person has got an interesting mix. This is a professional mountain biker who races a lot. So you're seeing a lot of time in this zone. It's important, you know, I tell you right now, VO2 max as a whole, or time in the classic VO2 max training zone, is super important to a mountain biker. And these areas are right where that falls in the eye levels. You remember those charts that Andy and I were showing you that's very related. And here they are racing a lot and training in it, and you see what's happening. This is a UCI pro racing, I don't know, 30 times this year. So he's just getting a deep dive in that. But if we look a little deeper, you know, what this is percentage, by the way, percentages. We go a little deeper, always have a report and a chart. You know, so many times that something gets lost in one or the other. So the reality is, here is their percentage time in zone, and I fix this with athlete ranges again. So you notice I only have 2016, but it's showing me the season, base build, race, and here up here I have all workouts, so entire history. So if you're just loading this, that might take a little bit of time to crunch because it's going to look at every piece of data you have. Once it's crunched, it'll be much faster. It compiles and saves it. So you can see these percentages. I don't want to go through it in the name of time, but you might notice the percentages aren't as different as you might think. But then when you look at it as time, it can be pretty different. So here I have them as time frames. So look at both at all given times because they can tell you two different stories. So make sure you're always looking at the two of those. Pretty cool chart, gives me excellent insight of percentage in zone and just the raw time in zone. So look how much this athlete, even though their overall time is so much lower, in the season they've got 75 hours of endurance, right, and 31 hours in FRC. In race, they're 25 hours of endurance, barely find time, you know, and then here you see 14 hours. So Will says, how would you adjust them for running? Well, I don't know what running is, but I think you mean time in power zone for running. We're going to have to adjust that. So there really is no time in zone for running that we support at this time. I know that there's some people coming out and saying, hey, you have a running FTP and that you can use zones. And some people are actually using Andy's power training levels for running zones. Don't do that. They were not built for running. I'm not saying that there isn't appropriate zones for running and there isn't a system that's going to fall out. But the efficiency of running is not nearly what it's like on a bike. A bike is much more efficient, so the zones were meant to deal with that efficiency. And people, the efficiencies in individuals is way more different in running than on a bike. Think about on a bike. We're all attached to pedals, handlebars, and a seat, right, and pedaling down the road. Running isn't like that. Running efficiency is really broad between one runner and the other, so it's really hard to say these are training levels. So I would rely more on heart rate and some other factors before I would go to power. My 2 cents, again, you guys, my opinion, it doesn't mean right or wrong. I know there's some cool studies being done with running with power, and my guess is within the next couple of months you're going to see more and more information coming out about how to manage it. This is a chart I use. I've used this in a lot of different ones, so I don't want to go deeply. I use it as a go-to. I'm just basically breaking down between time over 125%, time over 105%, time over 90. And of course I could put time everything else, but I'm just assuming that. And I'm looking for changes in seasons. Here I'm comparing, this is back to my longer term trend, so I'm just comparing 4 years. I can see this athlete over 4 years, and this was this person was a consulting, and they hadn't really changed their performance in the last 4 years, meaning they were kind of stuck at a plateau. Anybody watching here want to guess why? So that's why this data is so important that you look over time too when you're analyzing a season. Because I'd look at this season, if I was this person's coach for the 2016, I'd say, man, I should have done things differently because I just did what we always did. So, Craig, I'll get to that answer. I see your question. Here's a really interesting chart, And I think you'll get a lot of insight from this. Look, you guys, I'll tell you one thing I've learned in coaching at different levels. There's no shortcut to some degree, and there is no magic. I mean, even all this data, don't use data to find magic. Don't use analytics to find magic, right? Use analytics to focus your training time to increase the odds of getting the best possible result and achieving a goal. That's not magic. That's hard work. That's thinking and focused on the right things and going out and you got to do the work. And at the end of the day, in the realm of it's not magic, more work trumps. Sorry, anybody who's out there preaching just HIIT training or high intensity and it's better and stuff like that, you don't have me as a believer. Because I've just seen it time and time again. You can't build as high, you can't do as well. In the end of the day, and don't get me wrong, I only got 6 hours to train, even 8 hours to train, I would absolutely prescribe high intensity approach. Absolutely. Because in those time frame, if that was my limiter, my obstacle, it's the best use of time. But anything really over 10 hours or 8 hours, it's a trap. It's a plateau, fast result trap. Eventually got to go out and do the work. Part of doing the long work is long riding. You have a metabolic system that runs. It's a pretty big battery. It'll run for a while. It'll run for 4 hours plus on the charge. If you don't learn to deplete and dump and train when you're dumped, you're really leaving a lot of potential fitness and a lot of potential results on the table. So this chart just tracks long rides. But check this out. This was the consult again that I did for somebody. So average duration, look at the average duration, 131, 142, 119, 132, 4 seasons. I'm looking at, remember their question was they've been stuck for the last 4 years. Just doing well, but just not, the same kind of range of performance. So I said, okay, how many rides do you have over 4 hours? Well, in 2016, they did more. They had 27. In 2015, they only had 19. In 2014, they had 16. And then they had 11 in 2013. So they did more rides over 4 hours. So somebody gave them some good advice. But then I started looking at the rides, and I said, wait a minute. You're doing a lot of coasting. Spending a lot of time in the Alps and in Mallorca going up and down hills. And this is one of the athletes I met at one of our training camps in Mallorca. So I said, let's do a 4-hour ride of just pedaling. So I used pedaling duration instead of duration. And wow, we lost a look, only 15, 16, 7, 6. So the person goes on long rides, but they coast a lot. They coast a lot in these type of rides. So they're not really being effective. So then I said, well, let's track how many rides you have at 3,500 kilojoules and above. And now look. So you usually use, so for a rider, when you're looking at a pro rider, right, there's this classic myth, but it's not a myth, it's a classic legend based on a lot of truth. You got to be able to ride a 4,000 kilojoule ride. Like that is your true endurance ride. Go out for 4,000 kilojoules. Well, for an average male pro weighing around 150 to 160 pounds, that's a pretty good number. 4,000 kilojoules is a good number. You might ask, how would you adjust that number? By weight. So you use calories by size. Just think about how you process an exercise calorie versus a burned calorie. The relationship is that fact that it really is relevant to your weight. So you would adjust it by weight. That's a cool chart. If somebody remembers to email me, I'll build a profile chart on that because I could show you the formula for it. So if you're a 155-pound male, around 4,000 calories, 3,800 calories, or 38 kJs is a good endurance ride, like a deep endurance ride, what I call a high volume ride. If you are a 110-pound female, that might be 3,000 to 3,200. Lots of ways to get these. Ride harder, you get more kilojoules per hour. It really depends. You could ride longer. The point here is, if you just look at these data, if I just looked at this, the average duration seems a little short, but hey, they're getting some longer rides. But then I used analytics to drill down, not quite what we thought. And then when we really look, they're going too slow. So they're go out there for a 5, 6, 7 hour day, right? Because if they had 27 rides over 4 hours, of which 3 got 3,500 kilojoules. If If you're riding, you know, good high endurance, you're probably getting 600-700 an hour. If you're dillying around at 400 an hour, it's going to take you a lot of time. Not that that's bad, but just know it's going to take a lot of time. So you get the point. I want to keep moving on. This chart is in there. Take a look at it for your athlete. The chart name, somebody asked, I see I cut it off. I think it is high volume rides. It'll have a new banner on it. Just look through your new charts. But it definitely got loaded. I'll look for it in the end because I'm already so late. Physiological tracking. Here's another breakthrough chart. I'm looking for it on my other computer, you guys. I think it is. So Robert, you said you found it. What's the name of it? Can you put it in the question box? And you guys are great, like doing my job for me. I love it. This is a really cool chart. You guys take a look at this when you get a chance. I'm only tracking right here, CTL in blue, and they're the same because I'm just using shaded and highlight. It is high volume rides is the name, by the way. Here I'm tracking in purple, or I'm sorry, in blue, VO2 max. Here I'm tracking modeled FTP, which I should have made orange. I got the colors backwards. Actually, Andy set this up for me, but we both should have got the colors. And then the orange is the percentage, how much of your FTP are you taking up in versus your VO2 max. So here's 4 years, right? Look at this athlete. Summer, build. Their VO2 max is going up. MFTP is following. And they're maximizing around 85%. They rest. Next year comes around. The fitness isn't as long, but they get a peak. That's pretty close, right? And actually, they closed the gap in their threshold a little better. This person was doing something more interesting in threshold. But the reality is, if you look at CTL, they actually were, they seem to get the highest when this person rests a little. This is the same athlete, by the way, that needed 26, to be 26 TSB positive to get peaks. So it's just making me think. Then year 3, they extended a little longer. And they always have a September event, a big event in the first week of September. That's why it's kind of later. But MFTP, the percentage, it goes back to being flat. And then this year, they don't move it up. But look, they actually did more work, sort of. So that gives us insight, man. This is a killer chart. This tells me what they were doing, where they added volume. Probably were not adding the right type of volume. Their VO2 max didn't go up, threshold didn't go up, the percentage stayed flat. But yet you can see they did more work, which some of the other charts, this is the same athlete we were looking at, tells me. Take a look at this chart for your, and maintain, you really want to target, Andy posted in the Facebook, like the database history, 85 to 90% is pretty darn fit. I will give you a heads up, the higher your natural VO2 max, the harder, the inverse, somebody was pointing this out on the list, the inverse, it's harder. A really good pro with a super high VO2 max is not going to get to 90% percentage of MFTP. It's too many other factors, too many other barriers. I look at physiology. This is the same marker report that's been in there. You've all seen this. I'm looking at the last 4 years. Looking at the numbers. This is something you're familiar with in the time nature I'm pressing on, but anybody can stop me with questions, but I don't want to get it too low. I only have 1 or 2 more slides, but I want to do Q&A because they're backed up. Compliance. This is a really cool compliance chart that I bet you no one is using. I wrote this a long time ago, and it was like I was doing some season reviews this year, and I started rewriting a compliance chart. I'm like, what am I doing? I remember writing one, so I went and found it, and I'm like, wow, this was cool. So the reality is here you're having, this is just a variation of planned versus actual. So you have duration, TSS, and distance. So I always plan in duration and TSS. I rarely ever put distance. So the distance just looks like everything's a variant. That's because I didn't put anything in, it was 0. But look here at this athlete, right? Not that much. Above means they did more, below means they did less. So the reality is this person tracked pretty closely with prescription, didn't they? So their compliance was pretty good. I can't, if that resulted in this, it's not the athlete's fault. They did what I told them to do. Their compliance was high. You can see that in the TSS, pretty good. There's a little mix up in here. We all miss out, have a bad week and things go wrong. Again, I didn't write distance, so that is. Down here, and you could always expand this chart pack is planned versus actual cycling. down here is the blue bars or the green bars are actual. The planned TSS in the squared is showing. So they pretty much follow the line. If you kind of looked at this close, it was an overlap. Pretty cool compliance chart. There is no, that's it. In the end of the day, that's really good compliance. You don't need a whole lot of other charts. This is a killer chart pack people have to start using again. Somebody asked, do I always prescribe duration and TSS? Yes, I always prescribe duration, TSS, and occasionally kilojoules. So it depends what I'm targeting. Like on my longer endurance rides, I'll say hit 300 TSS or 3,200 kilojoules, whichever comes first. So sometimes I'll use kilojoules like that. Otherwise than that, it's always duration and TSS. Okay. So that, I'm going to go to Q&A. You guys, some great resources coming up. And then I'll start answering questions, just let whoever doesn't want to hear the answers drop off. We have a TrainingPeaks University coming up. I have some of these things loaded here. So TrainingPeaks University, you can find us online. I put the link in here. I'll send out this report to everybody. TrainingPeaks University is a great place if you're newer with WKO4, you want good foundational work, the foundations of analytics and stuff like that. It's in Boulder. It's fun. That's going to be conducted by Dean Golich and myself. You know, come on out, see us, you know, and have some fun. It's a really great course. Boulder's a great place to be. It's at the TrainingPeaks at our corporate office, which I don't spend enough time there, so it really is an amazing place to visit. Very cool office. In November, we've been asked by NIFS, the National Institute for Sport, to put on a conference about, they're really looking at, their whole goal is innovation, what's the cutting edge. They saw what we were doing in WKO4, asked us to put on a conference. So you can sign up for this. We've got good CEUs, 12 CEUs for USAC, 6 for USAT. Really great presenter list. Andy, Dean, that's me. I only do the helmet shots. This is Kevin Williams, the creator of WKO4. Doesn't he look like a mobster? We have to get him out of that suit. Kenny Carlson will be there. Kenny is the Garmin. He leads the development, the international development of head units. So he's the guy who designs your Edge and 820s and 520s and things like that. Amber Neben, pro world champion, two-time Olympian, one of my athletes, is going to join us. She's been training with Power from 2002. We'll do a nice presentation as far, and she's a coach. Bobby Julich, most of you guys probably know Bobby. Bobby is a well-known pro, years of performance, Olympic medalist, and, you know, all around good guy. His coaching, he coaches. He's a coach, and this is what he does now is for a living. He's coached, as you probably know, for Tinkoff and Sky. He actually is running a consulting and a private coaching business now. He's moved back to the States. He'll be joining us. And Bobby's a great WKO4 user. He's actually part of our Facebook group. And then Nate Keck. Nate is with Quark. And Quark is going to be demoing, along with Kenny, some cool new ideas and products at the event, so feel free to join us there. Joe Bacana and out of New York City has asked me to do an event with him. So I'll be presenting at this New York City Training with Power primer. Great little event. Feel free to join us. Our education center, if you're newer, watch the tutorials, watch the videos. I'm always listing these events and webinars and seminars down the bottom, so they'll be posted there. Make sure you follow it. And don't forget to join the Facebook group. All right, infomercial is over. You know, you guys had to sit through a little bit of it. You guys, I'd love to see you at a TPU or a ITP. You know, if you're a WKO4 user and you're in the Facebook group, I have a discount for each of them. Just email me. There's some discount code that I can give you. Let me know. Okay, I'm going to go backwards through questions. If you don't want to hear the questions, feel free to drop off. I got a decent chunk of them, but some I did not. So, can we quickly back over the MMP peaks time-based chart and explain the percentages again? Okay. Now you're on borrowed time. This one. So this was the chart that had the percentages in it. And here's just a blow up of the little right-hand side. So all the percentages are, Phil, is I'm looking at a peak. So let's take 2016, for example. The peak was 325 watts. That was their fastest 20-minute peak. Then I look at their average MMP top 5, so I'm taking the top 5 and I'm averaging them, is only 308. So 308 is 94.8% of 325. That type 5 average should be more like 320. When you're peaked, you can do things repeatably. That is a form peak. It's part of my fatigue resistant argument. So every once in a while you can catch a flyer and hit one good number. That's not peak. That's not, if you're particularly racing a lot, pro, or just have a heavy season, you got to be able to repeat. You're a stage racer, you got to be able to repeat. So I want that repeatability, that range, to be high. So the percentage simply represents a percentage of the cluster, top 5 in this case. Sometimes I use top 10 when I'm using more data. So percentage of the cluster to the absolute peak. How percentagely close are they? So I hope that answers the question. High volume rides, I did give you an idea of how I calibrate. So Kate, it's the calibration is, there's plenty of formulas for it. You could actually find it on the internet, but most people can burn, 4 hours is a pretty good number. So you really want to be able to dump that entire glycogen store. It's more complex than that, but it's a simple way of saying it. That typically happens for most of us in about 4 hours. As a triathlete, which I think is a lot of your main, that's really important to you. So understanding how your system works in that range and being able to train it is important. One thing I can tell you, and it's a simple example, that system is like an old-fashioned battery, like an old-fashioned headlamp battery. So if you don't totally deplete it, each time it recharges, it doesn't recharge to max. It does not recharge to max. So the depletion is really important so that each time it charges back to max and maybe a little bit more. It also is a performance factor that if you're not depleting, coming up to a bigger event, if you're not going through at least one phase of depleting, that battery never really charges back to max and you don't have it in your event. So around 4 hours it tends to happen for all of us, but if somebody reminds me, I'll build a chart tomorrow, maybe trying to use a profile of it. There's a couple of different formulas for figuring out. But 4,000 kilojoules at 150 to 160 pound male. I can tell you right now, I target Amber's and she's 110 pounds at 3,200 to 3,400. Remember, to be honest with you, she's a genetic freak. No better way of saying it. So that is what it is. So that's calibration. A couple of questions about weight. If I was 80 kilograms, I'd look at maybe 41, 42. There's a diminishing returns getting too high because the weight there's a point where you're just not, your calories burned needed is, it is linear, but there is a point of diminishing returns. So if I was 80 kilograms, I'd be targeting 4,200. It's not a light switch, you guys. It's a transitional phase, but it is pretty important that you do it. It's one of those things that's gotten lost. It used to be old school 4,000 kilojoules, but it wasn't just a myth. There's some pretty good reality behind it. All right, knocking closing questions now. So Craig, you asked this a couple of times and I didn't do it. And I'll post something in the Facebook by Thursday, just not overcommitting. So Craig asked a couple of different ways. So I'll answer his last question and work back into it. The season review is based on PD curve. How do you take into account when you do road, mountain bike, and cross in the same season? My road power is, say, 10 watts higher than mountain bike, and mountain bike is 10 watts higher than cross. So the simplest thing you can do, one that's hard, right? And the reality is, I will answer it at one level, which matters, but is just take it as an overarching answer. Be careful of over-precision again. So at this phase, you're getting some factors happening in there, but when you're talking about a season review, those ranges aren't making dramatic impact on what's happening. If you looked at the TSS effect and some other factors, it's not as dramatic. If you're looking at a peak power performance, peak is peak. If you could generate it on a tricycle, it's still what's affecting, right, what you can do. So ask yourself, Craig, why do you do 10 watts less on a mountain bike and why do you do 10 watts less on a cross bike? Is it because of the terrain and other things you're riding on and the universe? Or what happens if you took your mountain bike out on the road and just drilled it for, I don't know, 20, 40 minutes? Or your cross bike and just drilled it for 20, 40 minutes? Would you run the same power as your road bike? Because a watt is a watt. What is the difference? Is it mechanical? Is it positional? So the problem was with adjusting, right? Be careful it's not a mechanical thing. It could be physical. I'm not saying it isn't. I'm not saying, Phil, you're not right. Yeah, and you're pointing out it's terrain, right? Take those bikes out and drill it and see if you're maximal. Remember, the PD curve is driven by maximal effort. Your TSS might be a little over because you can't quite hit those numbers based on terrain, but it's not really over, right? It's actually showing you the stress. I really need you to think about that. It's a discussion I was having earlier with somebody. The reality is if you can't do those final 10 watts on your mountain bike, that doesn't change the stress. Stress is the external thing that your body is going under. It's a measurement of that. A watt is a watt. Therefore, it doesn't really change the strain. So stress is the external factor. Strain is the internal factor. Strain leads to adaptation. So it doesn't really change the strain, right? The strain is still 10 watts less. Why do you think so many really good mountain bike pros train half their time, if not more, on their road bike, or have pure slicks on a mountain bike and do it on the road? Because the reality is if you can't hit that power, it is less strain and it's less stress. Now, that's not absolute when I say less strain because there's other strain, right, that TSS and PMC don't take into account. You're using more upper body in both those mountain bike and cross. There's other factors. So I'm only pointing out that the mechanism of TSS and what it's measuring was really meant around the efficiency of, and generally it started with a road bike. But it translates very well into your mountain bike cyclocross answer because the reality is for what it measures, yeah, if you can't do those final 10 watts on those bikes, you're going through less stress and strain. So I can give you an example. Amber, I just showed it. So when I work with Amber, she's a time trial specialist. So we want to spend a decent amount on our time trial, but we never do maximal power work on our time trial bike because she can't generate it in her time trial bike. Her position holds her back. The bike holds her back. So we don't adjust all our numbers to that. That's just it's a mechanical thing. It's a positional thing. But when we want max power, we get on a road bike, and for her at 50 kilos, we go on a road bike and we point that bike up a hill and we crush it. It's the only way it's going to happen. So think about what I'm saying, right? I'm really answering your question in general as far as my philosophy. People can say, nope, he's wrong. It's more stress and strain. Great. That's part of what find ways to measure it here. Now, another thing you can do from I could actually try it. So I've got all kinds of weird stuff going on here, you guys. So I don't know this is my sandbox fake set, so I don't know what'll work here. Let me see if I can just find somebody that would work. All right, here's two fakes. So you can tag workouts. So if I drilled into a workout, you guys, I appreciate so many people staying on. I'm glad to answer them all. Sorry it's going long. So if you tagged a workout race, or actually for your example, target MTB, right? So you see the MTB comes up and that's there. So let's say I just tagged this. Oh boy, wait, that was stupid. Let me tag a better one. There's a trail day, right? There was no data in that, so nothing I would have showed you would have worked. So let me I'm going to tag this, what did I say, MTB. So right, if I tag that MTB now with the workouts taggable, you see up here in the top filter box, let's say I tagged like 10 of them, I don't want to do it. I can just drag over that and look, if I type MTB and enter, give it a second to think, it's going to find, oh, they're tagging their own. Look, they have ones in the title. Notice it found every workout that has MTB in it. So somewhere in the workout, the notes of the tag, it has MTB. So you can tag and whatever, but tag, specifically tag, if you wrote a report up at the athlete level, so let's say you created a new chart, it was custom, and I wanted this chart to be power, right? Oh great. Let's see. That's funny. So if I wanted this chart, let's say, to be, I don't know if this is going to work because I only tagged one, average power. It's not going to calculate power at this level because I'm not telling it what to do. But I only tagged one chart. If I targeted average power, it's going to show me an average power of every ride, right? So you can use the has tag. It's not hashtag, you guys. It's has tag. So if you use, and I'm going to get this wrong, watch. That's why I said, oh boy, the pressure's on. I need has tag. I'm going to get it wrong. I have to send it to you and build it. That's so funny. Hashtag comma. I haven't hashtagged in a while. Comma mountain bike power. I think I need to, I forget what's going to trigger it. I'll post it in Facebook in the morning. Caught me by surprise there. I should know this one. You guys getting old sucks. Your brain is the first thing to go. But the reality is if I had it right, it would only pull the data that I tagged from workouts on hashtag. So I'll send you the chart. I'll send you the hashtag link. Look it up in your expressions, hashtag too. It's in there on how to use it. That's funny. But you can use that hashtag. So you could just pull the information just from your mountain bike races that you tagged. All right, going back. Lots of questions about the kilojoules, you guys. I don't even think I have these. Oh, wait, I synced. So in the kilojoule charts, there's one. Of course, now it's got to read all that data. And mine's got a bunch of wacky data in it. The reality is look at the expression, and you'll see what the kilojoules is. It's work. It's just kilojoules. Remember, a kilojoule and a watt are the same thing. A joule and a watt. So the reality is when you see that, sometimes it looks like, well, that's power. It doesn't matter. A watt, 1 watt is 1 joule. So it's the same number. Okay, I think I've gotten through all the questions. This is going to load, but so if you look at the config of these, so PD after, so peak after. So basically it's the cumulative summary power. So there's the kilojoules right there. So I'm saying when it's over, greater than 2,000. So you could change that number to be 3,000, 4,000, 1,500, whatever. That's the number you would change. And that answers about 7 questions. That's the number you change. Cool. I think I've gotten through all the questions. Are there any additionals? Great. I've taken so much of your time. It's amazing, guys. Stay on. I'm glad to help. And whatever. Post your questions in Facebook group if you have them tomorrow. If anybody wanted the discount code to the events that I showed you, just email me. I'll gladly find it and send it to you. Have Debbie send it to you. Really love to see and meet you at one of the events. Come on out and spend some time with us and keep learning. All right, everybody. Thanks for coming. Good night.